The second part of this lecture will start out by talking about the teeth. The teeth are very, very important to the digestive process. You notice I specifically said the digestive process. You'll remember digestion is the breakdown of complex food molecules into simpler food molecules for absorption. And so the teeth are very important for this. In the front there are the incisors, which are the cutting teeth, which cut through food. The cuspids, which are the tearing teeth. And then the bicuspids, which do light grinding. And then the molars, which do heavy grinding and grind the food into smaller and smaller pieces. Now the third molar, or the last molar, is called the wisdom tooth. And wisdom teeth are removed because there is no way to adequately keep those teeth clean, and they will eventually become seriously cavitied and require removal under a degree of discomfort. And when that happens, it's known as impaction, and it can also occur when the teeth fail to break the surface of the gum and you have to go through the surface of the gum in order to get the tooth out. Now the primary teeth are teeth that occur in babies. They're also called the baby teeth, whereas the subsequent teeth that come out are called adult teeth or permanent teeth. Now the process of chewing is called mastication. Again, it accomplishes two things: the grinding down, but then also mixing this material with the saliva, which is important digestive juice. The top of this is called the crown, where most of the action is. There's the neck, which is at the gum line of the tooth, and then the root, which is below the gum line, which anchors the tooth in the mandible or maxillary bone. Inside the tooth is the pulp, and this is where blood vessels and nerves occur, and they're not in the toot, they're in the tooth. From the pulp going out is dentin. Dentin is a bone-like material that surrounds the pulp and protects it, and then the hardest substance in the body, which is the enamel, is on the outside and particularly thick on the crown. The tooth is then fastened into the jaw by a material called cementum, and all throughout this whole process, the important element is an element called fluoride, which strengthens the enamel, which gets into the little spaces between the enamel molecules and strengthens the enamel. Then we move on to the throat, and the throat moves back. If you go to the base of the tongue, which is the end of the oral cavity, then there's this funnel called the pharynx, the pharynx. And the pharynx is this funnel-shaped cavity behind the oral cavity. And this is where the eustachian tubes empty. Remember, the eustachian tube is a tube that leads from the ear into the throat, and it empties in the pharynx. So what happens to teeth? Well, teeth can have what's known as a caries. Caries are when sugar and bacteria get together in the mouth and they form a lactic acid. And the lactic acid works on the enamel and causes a breakdown of the enamel, which is called a caries or a cavity. And this is what's known as tooth decay. And these cavities can cause serious problems with the tooth if they get past the enamel and past the dentin into the root area. And bacteria gets into the root area and can cause serious pain and discomfort, and can actually lead to something known as a root canal, which is when the dentist has to drill through the enamel into the root and then fill that and get all of that infection out, and then fill that up with a composite to prevent this from happening again. Now on the outside of the tooth, there's a colorless film called plaque, which has bacteria in it, and again, this can also form lactic acid, which can break down the tooth. The other thing that can happen to teeth is a buildup of material on the outside of the tooth between the gum and the tooth. And when this plaque gets in this area right here, it causes inflammation and irritation of this area. And this inflammation below the gum line, which is shown here, leads to what's known as periodontal disease. Now, perio means that it's beside the tooth itself and causes the inflammation in this area, and the gum actually recedes from the tooth, and eventually you can lose the tooth because of this problem. And this hardens and forms a calculus, which is called tartar, which the dentist removes with that sharp implement when you go to the dentist office. And gingivitis, again, remember, itis means inflammation, and it's inflammation of the gingiva, and gingiva is just a fancy word for the gum. Once you've swallowed the food, it leads to the esophagus. And the esophagus is fundamentally a tube that leads from the pharynx to the stomach. And when you swallowing is actually a very complex muscular act. When you swallow, once it enters the esophagus, then there's a peristaltic contraction which forces the bolus of food down into the stomach. And the way a lot of people used to think that swallowing was a passive and the food just kind of rolled or fell down the esophagus, which is not true. And the way you can prove this is if you stand on your head and swallow water, it still ends up in your stomach. And so this peristalsis, which we've talked about before, is the muscular, ring-like muscular movement that forces the food down into the stomach. Here is a flap of tissue called the epiglottis. When you swallow, the epiglottis slams or shuts down over the entrance into the airway. This is called the larynx, where the air goes into your trachea and into your lungs. This covers that opening so that the food does not go down into your lung. Now the stomach is shown here. It's a sac-like structure that stores the food and also is part of the digestive process, which it continues a peristaltic action in order to continue the action of breaking down the food. And there's also enzymes which break down carbohydrates and proteins. There are 3 muscular layers shown here, and you notice that the orientation of the muscle fibers is different. And this allows for the muscle to continually massage the food bolus in such a way as to lead to it being broken down. And it also mixes it with those enzymes. Now, when the contractions occur when the stomach is empty, we feel this as a discomfort that we call hunger pangs or hunger contraction. The gastric juice is secreted. It contains acid and certain enzymes that aid in digestion. The acid is hydrochloric acid, and when you get into chemistry class, you'll find out what hydrochloric acid is. But it works on the food to soften the food. It also works to kill bacteria that's in the food when you eat it. The principal enzyme in your stomach is called pepsin. Pepsin works to break down the proteins. There are also gastric amylase. You remember amylase breaks down amylose or carbohydrate, and there are gastric lipases that break down lipids. It also in the stomach is a specific chemical called intrinsic factor. An intrinsic factor is important for one thing, and that is the absorption of vitamin B12. If you don't have intrinsic factor, then you will not absorb vitamin B12. Once the food has been worked on for a period of time, it becomes a thick liquid. And this thick liquid is called chyme, and this chyme is transferred into the small intestine. And the transfer occurs across the pyloric sphincter. Now the cardiac sphincter is up here. The cardiac sphincter is the valve between the esophagus and the stomach and prevents the reflux of stomach contents into the esophagus. Remember, this is acid in here, and this acid will cause damage to the esophagus if it's too much of it comes on the esophagus. And so the cardiac sphincter prevents that from happening. The pyloric sphincter on the other end is what controls the release of the food into the small intestine. Now there are two organs that are not part of the tube. They're called the liver and the pancreas. We're going to talk about them for just a minute or two. First of all, there's the liver, which is this big organ right here. And underneath the liver is something called the gallbladder, which holds bile and transports the bile into the small intestine when necessary. And you see this little thing called the common bile duct. The common bile duct goes from the liver into the small intestine. Bile is a substance that's important for fat digestion and absorption. And if you don't have enough bile, you can't absorb fat. And if you don't absorb the fat, then it comes out and is eliminated and causes problems. As I said, the gallbladder stores the bile and releases the bile when fat enters into the small intestine. And the bile works to emulsify or dissolve fats from large fat droplets into smaller fat droplets, which can be absorbed. And then subsequently an enzyme acts on the fat molecules to break the fat molecules down, and this enzyme is called lipase. The common bile duct, as I stated before, leads from the liver into the small intestine, specifically the duodenum here, and that results in the release of the bile into the small bowel. The pancreas, which is here, this is the pancreatic duct, which leads into this. This is the main pancreatic duct, and then there's an accessory pancreatic duct here. The pancreatic duct leads from the pancreas into the small bowel, and it allows for the transport of pancreatic juice into the small intestine. This pancreatic juice, secreted by the pancreas, contains enzymes like trypsin and chymotrypsin, which break down proteins. It also contains bicarbonate, which neutralizes the hydrochloric acid. Also in the juice is lipase, which breaks down fat, amylase, that breaks down carbohydrates, and then sodium bicarbonate, which neutralizes the acid. The principal job of the small intestine is absorption. The proximal part of the small intestine is the last site of digestion, and then the rest of the small intestine is where absorption occurs. The duodenum, which is the first third of the small intestine, is where the digestion continues to occur. The jejunum and ileum are where the absorption occurs. There are intestinal glands which do produce digestive enzymes, but absorption, or the movement of nutrients from the lumen into the bloodstream, is the principal activity in the small intestine. The site of absorption is called the villi, and the villi are designed to maximize the surface area for the absorption of food. And underneath these villi are blood vessels that receive the nutrients. They're called capillaries. Central to each of the villi is something called the lacteal, and this is a lymph vessel that absorbs fat. Fats are packaged with proteins in something called a lipoprotein, and glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrates in the liver and in the muscle. Glycogen stores about 4 to 5 hours worth of energy in the form of carbohydrate. Insulin is released by the pancreas and allows for the absorption of sugar into blood cells and into the cells of the body. And glucagon is the opposite hormone, also released by the pancreas, that increases the blood sugar and makes more blood sugar available. And the last of the waste products that are produced is something called urea, which is a breakdown of the amino acids. The last of the organs that we'll talk about is the large intestine. The large intestine's principal job is to reabsorb water. When the stream of food, after everything has been absorbed from it, reaches this part of the large intestine known as the cecum, it's approximately 10 liters of fluid. 10 liters of fluid is 2.5 gallons of fluid. So you can imagine if the water wasn't reabsorbed, what that would mean. the kind of diarrhea that would result in. So the large intestine reabsorbs over 90% of the water that comes into it. At the cecum is the appendix. We've talked about vestigial organs, and the appendix is one of those organs that's thought to be a vestigial organ. And it can be occluded and inflamed, and again, inflammation, itis, inflammation of the appendix is it called an appendicitis. And the valve between the end of the small intestine and the large intestine is called the ileocecal valve, and it acts to allow the food stream to enter into the colon. If, for whatever reason, the colon does not reabsorb enough fluid, it can result in what we call diarrhea. And then ultimately the food stream, now fecal stream, ends up in the rectum. Rectum is a word that means straight, and that's exactly why this is called rectum, is because it's straight. And then it's eliminated as solid waste through the anus, which is the exit from the body. So what are some things that can go wrong? Well, one is called food poisoning. I think we've talked about botulism before. This is the poisoning caused by botulinum toxin. There's also salmonellosis, which is salmonella can be in food, and if you eat it, it can reproduce and cause an intestinal infection. And then something called typhoid fever, which is also caused by salmonella. There's dyspepsia, which is a doctor word for heartburn. And then this, in its severest form, is peptic ulcers, or problems with ulcers in the stomach. They're called peptic because they're thought to be due to the action of pepsin on the mucosa. Truth be known, it's actually now known that this is caused by an infection called Helicobacter pylori. And then we can talk for a minute about the effects of alcohol. The principal effect of alcohol is that it's a toxin to the liver. However, it also can cause problems with the stomach. It increases the risk of ulcer. Constipation is essentially a decrease in the number of bowel movements. Now, most people believe that about one bowel movement a day is normal, but if you have to go at least 3 days without going to the bathroom before you're considered constipated. And then we talked briefly about diarrhea, which is more than the normal number of bowel movements for a person. And then severe diarrhea, which is usually associated with bleeding, is called dysentery. And this is most commonly associated with the salmonellosis, or a bacterial infection of the intestine. Colon cancer is the last thing we'll talk about. It's one of the most common forms of cancer in the United States, and it is the third most common cause of death in the United States.